Gonna be looking at bar height with stem length, maximize the ability on the trail.
Alright, welcome back to the channel. We're here with the Puffy crew.
This is the second video of our bike setup series, level 2 if you want to call it, a little bit more in depth, a little bit more why, and...
These are just a few things that you shouldn't be afraid to try to change, and they can really make a big difference on how your bike feels and how you're able to then ride your bike. We're going to go over setting your sag on your suspension, your bar height, as well as your stem length, things like that.
We can't tell you what's going to work best for you because these things are super personal. We can only kind of explain to you what they do and kind of directions that you can go for then you to kind of get out on the trail, make these small changes, and figure out how these things affect your bike. Yeah, do it.
So for my first video, we've set suspension up at the recommended settings. That's just going off of air pressure or spring weight in this case for the coil shock. But to go even deeper into that is to set up your sag yourself so you know exactly where you're sitting in your suspension. And bike makers will actually give you kind of recommended sag for their bike and their frame. So we're going to go through how to measure sag on a coil, which isn't so simple. If you find yourself a like-minded partner to do this with, you could probably do it yourself.
We can hear you.
Got a tape measure. So you're going to want to start to, hold on, let me bring this thing a little closer to me. So you have something to hold on to, and I'm going to bounce around on my bike and try to be in a good position where I'm now quite static. And Miranda here is going to measure eye to eye, so where the two center of the bolts are on my shock. What do we got?
210 on the nose.
210, and then you're going to want to get off your bike and measure again.
30.
Extended is the word you're looking
Extended the shock. Extent. So, now you're going to do a bit of math. So you're going to want to know the actual dimensions of your shock. This one in particular is a 210 by 30.
230.
230 by 60 millimeter shock. So that's 60 millimeters of stroke length. And that's where you want to take that 20 mil difference from the 210, 230 that I measured and divide that by 60 and you'll find your percentage sag. 230 is the full shock length minus 210, which is what we measured at sag, equal to a 20 millimeter difference. And then you want to divide that by your stroke length, which is 60, which is that, times it by 100 for a percentage, even though we can already know what that is, 33.3. That's quite soft.
That's how you like it.
I guess so. The altitude is super progressive, which actually works with the coil because the coil is quite linear. So that means that I'm kind of riding pretty deep in my travel, but I actually have a progressive stroke with the suppleness of a coil. And I kind of really liked how that felt, honestly, so I haven't really changed it since I put on this spring. Generally, rear suspension sag is anywhere from 25 to 30%, very roughly. I'm at 33, which means I'm sagging a little bit more into my suspension. But for the coil, I think that's okay because it's quite a linear stroke that I'm not kind of ramping up too hard and not too deep in that travel. So it seems to work for me. But knowing that, now that I've re-measured it, maybe I'll try a little bit stiffer of a spring. Something to try, it's the winter, I got all the time in the world. If you're outside of that 25 to 30% sag, either your bike manufacturer is saying that that is recommended, or you should add or decrease pressure to kind of get yourself back into that range, or look at changing the spring rate on your coil. And that might help kind of identify some problems you've been feeling on the trail. So we've done that for the coil. On air shocks, you generally have a rubber O-ring, so you can measure that yourself where you kind of go static on your bike. Well, it eliminates the use of a partner, and you can measure the shock at full extension from the seal to the rubber O-ring, and that's your millimeters of sag. And other brands have actual markers on their stanchions, so wherever that O-ring sits after you get off your bike, that's your percentage sag, so that's really easy to do. For the front, because we don't have that, again, we're gonna measure with the O-ring and figure that out. Do the same thing where you're kind of bouncing on your bike. You want to be kind of centered like you would be on the bike. It's harder when I'm holding myself up, but I have to imagine how much weight I have on my front. So what I'm going to do is once I've kind of like settled here, very slowly without my fork moving, push the O-ring down and then go off the back of the bike so that the fork only comes up and you're not actually pushing it down after that. And then we set it and we can measure it with my assistant here. What are we at?
The bottom of the O-ring is 38 mils.
So 38 divided by 170 mils of stroke is equal to 22. Whoops, not plus. Times. 22%. Also soft, but I knew that because I was running my fork pretty soft this year. 22% in the fork, which is maybe on the softer end, but it kind of seems to work for me, and I've kind of been riding low on my travel, but with this fork, it definitely works. Again, look at your recommended settings, and they should give you recommended sag, and so you can get really accurate on that. And it's just a good starting point. You can go stiffer, you can go softer, however you kind of feel like you're riding on the trails. From there, you want to work on balancing your bike. So as we have now seen, both of my front and rear are quite soft, but that means they're soft together, which means that my suspension is acting kind of in the same way. My settings are kind of the same as well, so that everything is kind of quite balanced. I'll hit bumps, I'll go through rough chunder, and my bike is reacting the same front and rear. Now that we've just done fork sag and kind of the ride height there, another way to change your ride height is with handlebar height. So Miranda's gonna talk you through what changing your handlebar height does.
So what I'm always kind of looking for on my bikes is to have a good central position over my bike. So that means I can move my weight forward or back easily, and part of that is having a good handlebar height. If your bars are too high, it's gonna put your weight further off the back, and you'll notice that, say like in a turn or something,